So to transition into our next interview, we've been interspersing what we're calling art bursts in the tradition of the National Performers Network before our interviews or within the interviews so that we continue to meld together the dialogue with the arts. So in that spirit, now you guys, are they all plugged in?
We're attached.
You're attached. You're attached.
I'm attached to all of you.
We're all somehow attached. So before we have our dialogue with Kimi and Julie, who we will introduce, I'd like to introduce Eric and Inez, who are going to perform a little cranky for you.
Three little fishies. We have to wing it. We have done it in a long time.
Down in the meadow, in the itty-bitty pool, there live three little fishies.
And the mama fishy too. She's coming.
Swim, said the mama fishies, swim if you can.
And they swam all over the dam.
A boom, boom,
Dee-da-dum,
wadum,
choo.
a boom, boom,
Dee-da-dum,
wadum,
choo.
a boom, boom,
Dee-da-dum,
wadum,
choo. And they swam all over the dam. Stop!
said the mama fishy.
Oh, you get lost.
But those three little fishies didn't want to get lost.
The three little fishes went out on the spree. And they swam right out to the sea.
A boom, boom,
Dee-da-dum,
wadum,
choo.
a boom, boom,
Dee-dum-da-dum,
wadum,
choo.
a boom, boom.
Dee-dum-da-dum, wadum, choo. And they swam
Right out to the sea.
Set the fishies.
It's a lot of fun. We can swim and swim until the day is done.
They swam till it was dark. When all of a sudden they saw
A shark.
Dee-dum-da-dum,
Wadum,
choo. Dee-dum-da-dum,
wadum,
choo. Dee-dum-da-dum,
wadum.
choo. When all of a sudden they saw
Help! Cried the little fishes. Just look at all those whales.
as fast as they could, they turned on their tails.
And it was back to the pool in the meadow they swam.
And they swam and they swam and they swam and they swam.
They swam.
And they swam and they still swimming and they swam.
Oh, there's the whales.
Woo! Oh, yeah, look at behind it. And they swam back over there. Well, that could be one of the endings.
That's a pretty ending.
Yeah,
It's a little
but-
sweet though. I don't know.
But also,
What's this one?
I don't know.
This
That's
is an awful ending. This
oh,
is
that's
who
terrible.
did that?
I don't know.
It's
I
like a
don't like
super
it.
fun
Oh
site.
no.
this
Let's
is
see.
really-
Maybe have
this is
another ending.
really-
A
Somebody
nice
really needs
good
to clean
one.
up this mess. This is
Oh, here we
really
go.
not
It's
acceptable.
really nice.
Not
Now look at
acceptable. Oh,
this.
we've got a third ending.
Yeah, not a speck of dirt anywhere. Isn't
Yeah,
that nice?
not a person either. I think this
Where's
looks
the
like.
where are the fishies?
I think that's a box store. I don't. Maybe I like the first ending better. I don't know. It's just this is. Somebody's making a lot of money. It's not me.
That's it. That was it.
Well, good afternoon. And now it's up to us three little fishies here. Tough act to follow. My name is John Potter. I'm the former arts editor of the Brattleboro Reformer. I'm now the executive director of the Latches Theater here in town. And I'm very honored and privileged to have been asked by Sandglass to help facilitate these conversations, which have been an amazing experience for me and hopefully for all of you as well. I'm here now today with Kimi Maeda, who's an artist, performer, prop and set designer, and creator of the piece Bend, which has been wowing audiences here at the festival, and we'll talk more about that with her. And also here with Julie Lichtenberg, who is director of the Performance Project of Springfield, Mass., and has some other projects to talk about, and we'll find out what you do as well. So our general theme is around generations and generations of otherness, and we'll leave it at that, and we'll explore that idea. So maybe we could start by having some word about the work you do. So Kimi, would you tell folks here about Bend and how it came about and what you were hoping to explore, and just fill us in a little bit on Bend.
It is a live performance piece where I do sand drawing on the floor, but I have live feed video of the sand drawing, but I combine the projections with archival footage from the Japanese American internment camps. And sorry, what was the other question?
And the story, and
yeah, so the story is about my father and his experience. He was 9 years old when he had to go to the Japanese American internment camp in Poston, Arizona. And in the same camp was Isamu Noguchi, the sculptor, who voluntarily went to the camp. He thought it was the best way for him to help the Japanese Americans. He didn't actually have to go because he was based in the East Coast at the time. He was in California, but he wasn't required. And the other aspect of this is my dad has been going through dementia, and so there's a big part about memory and forgetting, I guess, and especially now, so many of the survivors of the internment camps are dying. My dad is 82, so he was 9, he's 82 now, and so we're losing those stories now. So I think it's important to remember what happened.
Thank you. Julie, a little bit about what you do, and then we'll delve a little deeper.
Okay. I collaborate with young people in Springfield, young adults between the ages of 15 and really expands up to 25, to create performances that weave together personal narratives and themes that bring in larger systemic issues. But specifically, the young people that I work with identify as first generation. And we use that term to mean the first in their families to be growing up in this country, the first to be speaking English in their families. It could be the first in their families to be graduating from high school or going to college, first in their families to be openly queer, first in their families to not be incarcerated in several generations, the first in their families to be drug-free, the first in their families to be incarcerated, the first in their families to be a Muslim feminist, the first in their family to break a silence, the first in their family to be an artist. So really what began as an idea of creating a safe space in Springfield for immigrants and refugees expanded because we didn't want to be an exclusive space. So the performances will be in anywhere from 5 to 8 languages, and we do physical theater.
Thank you.
In a nutshell.
Thank you very much. If I could just bring up that there is a common thread of the horrors and sadness of World War II that links you to, and if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe how it's guided you in what you do now. So,
Me.
yes. Yeah.
So for me personally, I came into this work as an artist, but could not get away from the lens through which I look at the world, which is as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, someone who was in France between the ages of 5 and 10 years old. And I grew up with my mother's stories, and really how that informed me as a human and as an artist is that I think I really I was able to identify with oppressions from a very young age, especially racism in this country. And so all the work that I've done as an artist has always strived to identify those oppressions, but also what I feel is to achieve a sense of interconnectedness through the work as human beings.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So for Kimi, I was so intrigued by your choosing the two stories of your father and Noguchi to pass through Bend. If you could tell me about how that sort of came to you as something, and why you made that choice as an artist to tell those two stories together.
Yeah, my father was an art historian, and he started out studying Chinese landscape painting, but because that's what you did then, not many people were studying Japanese American or Japanese art at that time. So later in his career, he did start studying Noguchi and was really fascinated by this man that he remembers seeing in the camp. Noguchi would have been in his mid-30s. My dad would have been 9, so it's not like they would have interacted, but he was always fascinated by him and his work. And so my dad started working on a book and never finished it. And so in some ways, I think of this piece as kind of a way to take what my dad started and try to bring some conclusion to that. And also, I just find Noguchi's life really fascinating. His whole family is just really interesting in the way that it's going back and forth across from Japan to America. His mother was Irish American, and she had an affair with this Japanese poet who had come over and had this baby. Noguchi's father would have left at that point, but she made the decision to go to Japan, which is kind of unheard of at that time period. And she went to Japan and raised Isamu pretty much by herself. Isamu's dad had already formed this other family with another woman, so it was a very complicated relationship. But yeah, so Leone's a very, very interesting character, and then Noguchi's father was also an interesting character. He was a poet. He came to America when he was a young man, and he learned from these American poets and was writing in English, not in Japanese, and that's how he became famous, actually, not writing in Japanese, but in English. And then he went back to Japan where, well, he became famous because he was famous in America. So it's this funny sort of back and forth kind of thing. And yeah, and then Isamu's wife even was Shirley Yamaguchi, who was, she had many different names, but she was actually a Chinese film star, and then became a Japanese film star, and was actually in American movies as well. So, but she had trouble after World War II because the Japanese thought she was a spy. So all of these, for all of these reasons, I find Noguchi's life really interesting, because I also I felt growing up kind of in between two different cultures. You know, I grew up in New England, in Concord, Massachusetts, so I was in a very white town, and being one of 2 Asian kids in my elementary school was interesting. The other girl was actually adopted Korean. So, in some ways I felt like I didn't belong there, but then when my mom we'd go to Japan every other summer, and I definitely did not belong there either, so yeah, I find this idea of being in between 2 different places really interesting.
Thank you. Could you delve a little deeper into that otherness? In an email, you said that you had just been at the Alternative Roots conference, and that was something that had sort of roiled up with you at that conference, I guess, the idea of otherness. And if you could just talk about that. Obviously you grew up in New England, and we would think that that may not be something that you would deal with so much, but.
Yeah, I mean, there weren't a lot of people that looked like me in New England. So yeah, it's important in my work. It's just a theme that I return to all the time, and I think that in a way I felt like when I was growing up, like a lot of theater productions that I would see didn't really seem like they reflected my story, and so I think that I've come to this place where I'm trying to create my own stories and tell things from the way that I've seen things, So it's seeing or listening to the Mexicans the other day. I think it's what I find so great about puppetry, especially, is that you are able. It's empowering. Like, you can tell your own stories, I think, through the art of puppetry. So yeah.
And Bend is part of a trilogy of pieces. Could you talk about the other legs of the stool there?
The first 2 pieces are more shadow puppet based, and they're all still about family. But the first piece is more about my mom's journey from Japan to America. She's first. We call it's a little funny in the Japanese American community. First generation or Issei are the ones who came over from Japan. So she's Issei, and the second part is more. It's more just a nostalgic piece about home and what home means, which I think that's something I've struggled with a lot. Like, I do feel very much that New England is my home, but what exactly is that? And I think, for people who don't travel as much or aren't in between 2 different places, I think the idea of home isn't quite as complicated, but I think it always is actually a complicated thing, and so that's something that I'm investigating.
And I also thought a lot about home, the difference between home and homeland.
Yeah.
So you can travel a million places, but if you have a sense of connection or with your ancestry or your homeland, that can be a grounding thing. But if you've never lived in your homeland, that can be a very ungrounding thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Julie, could you elaborate a little bit on how you go about your work, the performance project, and how you get...
It's a little hard to understand you back here because the air conditioning...
Okay, I'll speak up. Yep. So could you elaborate on how you go about creating your pieces with your groups? And
Okay.
Yeah.
For example, the last piece that we created was called, in the end, it was called Fonale, which is Haitian Creole for "we must go." And it took us a little over a year to create it. The group comes together, and we spend 3 or 4 months in what we call our group building, skill building phase. Is that a good volume for you? And that means getting to know each other, building trust, like in terms of working together physically, as well as sharing life experiences, learning to move together as an ensemble, and also learning each other's languages. And I mean that not just in terms of the fact that one person, we had Amharic, Spanish, English, Kirundi, Haitian Creole, French, and English, and Nepali in that performance. So not just those languages, but also just the ways that people communicate beyond that language. So that was the first 3 or 4 months. And then we start looking, based on the stories that people are telling and the themes that they're bringing to the group, we start developing text and movement. And I give a lot of writing prompts and a lot of exercises and a lot of thinking. So for example, for Fonale, I used 2 jumping off points, departure points. One was a question I always ask the youth that I'm working with, which is, if you have an hour to speak to the world, what would you want to say? And I do that because I want us to go deep right away. I want to dispel any idea that we're going to be doing entertainment. You know, we have only 1 hour, and the entire world's going to be listening. What's the most important thing that you could possibly say? So that's a long brainstorm and a long conversation, and then I add on to that, because you have knowledge that nobody else has, because nobody else has lived your life or walked in your shoes. So based on your life experience, what knowledge or questions might you want to share with the world? The second big departure point for Fonale was to ask people to think about, if they were leaving their homeland, or when they left their homeland, what are the 4 or 5 things that they would want to bring with them? And it couldn't be documents or photographs or writing. It couldn't be flat. And why? What's the story? That opened a lot of doors for stories. What's the story in there? And so with the kids who were born and raised in Springfield, we define journey as going from here to there, perhaps emotionally. So that was another prompt, was in your life, explain to the group what there to here was and what here to the next place is. And so how do we define our journeys? And so for some people, it was a journey from a refugee camp in Tanzania to the US, or a journey from Bhutan to Nepal to the US, or, you know, informed by, triggered by the Rwandan genocide, triggered by the Bhutanese ethnic cleansing, or for some people it was a journey of never having been able to live in one apartment for more than 6 months or a year, or going from a sense of deep disconnection to seeking connection, you know, because of lack of parents. So the objects brought us into these stories, and then we work physically with the objects. We write about them. We make the soundscapes, or what we call vocal landscapes. And a lot of times it's the initial skills that are already in the group. Like somebody might be an incredible singer, an incredible writer, an incredible mover. Those are all, we use those as the paint, the palette, in a sense. And then after, I interview everyone. The interviews are transcribed, they get edited. So that's how the text comes together, either through writing, improvisation that gets videotaped and transcribed, or through interview. And there was one last interesting process that I've been working with. So many of the people that I work with, their English, they might just be coming the last 4 to 6 months in this country. So for instance, Geeta and Deepika really didn't speak English when we started the process of one of our shows. But I really wanted them to have the fullness of self-expression. It was a very funny interaction. So I said, well, I'm going to ask you questions, and I want you to answer me in Nepali. And they were like, but you're not going to understand me. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to audio tape you. I want you to be able to say anything that you want to say, not, you know, it was nice, because that's the 3 English words that you can say. So they wanted to talk about the Dasai festival in Nepal. So I got this interview that I really didn't understand at all. And I gave it to a student, a college student who was from Nepal, and they transcribed it and translated it into English. I edited the English, gave it back to them. They translated the edited version back into Nepali. And then I had the English and the Nepali to work with for the script. So, and we're doing the same thing with Arabic, and we've done the same thing with Kirundi. So the scripts come together like that. After, I also worked with some dancers who, and my background is in visual art. So after we have a script, it's usually a combination of text, and then it says movement sequence on it or something like that. And we go into rehearsal, and that's how our pieces come together.
Could you elaborate a little bit on your work having people tell you about objects? Because you gave a couple of examples when we talked, and that really was very helpful to me to understand how these objects help in the process and what these objects might be.
So, for example, in Fonale, this young woman, Wize, her object was a tree. And so we used a tree in the performance. And it was because growing up, she would always go to this one tree when she wasn't feeling good, when she got yelled at or was feeling alone or misunderstood. And she could remember doing that since she was 4 years old. This is, in the refugee camp. So that was one of the objects. One of the most pivotal objects, I would say, in Fonale was the water tap. Because Gita from Nepal identified the water tap as the place where if she could go back to anywhere, any one spot in Nepal, it would be the water tap, because the whole community gathered twice a day to get water. And they would get online, long lines, and argue about who was first and who was cheating to skip ahead. And it was where they would get the news of who was leaving for America or Australia, or who was getting married or who had died. And people would do each other's hair, and the kids would be running around and playing, and the old people would be chewing on nuts and arguing and taking care of people. And the water tap became the metaphor for the whole piece, in that place connected the group, the community. And so we acknowledged at that moment that everyone who was coming to Springfield from other countries lost that and couldn't find it in Springfield. They couldn't find a water tap, because especially if you're coming from a warm country in the winter in Springfield, nobody goes out. And they're used to living with their neighbors and seeing each other every day, but people that they may have known in Nepal live on the other side of Springfield, or maybe in Australia or in Canada. So for us, we acknowledged that first generation was becoming a water tap for us, and that's something that is lost in the transition from other communities and cultures. But we also then began to explore water as a theme. And so later on in the piece, when we were looking for a way to tell another part of Wize's story, which was that when she came to this country at 10, nobody told her that there was a different language. There was such a thing as a different language. She went to school, there was no translator, and she didn't understand why people didn't understand her. And she didn't understand anybody. It was really traumatic. Until one teacher began to sit down with her, and somehow, it almost sounded like a Helen Keller situation, because nobody explained to her what was going on. She had no grasp of what was going on. So in our piece, there's this one scene towards the end where she's running around looking for water, and everyone it's like a Tower of Babel. Everyone in the community is speaking a different language, and nobody can understand her. So that's kind of
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But they pull these objects throughout that show. So Fonale is a journey, and it branches off into different stories, but everybody is on the same journey, and they're moving with their objects in the piece.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What observations have you gleaned from the people you work with about their experience of otherness? How does otherness make them feel? That kind of thing. What are you observing from them about what's going on with them because of otherness?
It's really well, in Springfield is quite different than New York City or Chicago, where you have bigger populations of people from around the world. So in Springfield, Springfield was, primarily people of European descent, African American and Latino, primarily Puerto Rican. And so, and not good relationships between those groups. In fact, I think it was in the New York Times a couple of years ago that it was considered the most racist city in the country. So there's a lot of beef in Springfield on all levels, in the politics, in the school politics, about which principals can control a particular school district. It's really sad, really sad. And then, of course, those are the models that the young people go by. So when the Nepali youth start coming into the city, or the Guatemalan youth, or the Salvadorian, or the African youth from Somalia, Sudan, Burundi, Tanzania, they're really isolated. So they experience a tremendous amount of isolation or otherness, and it's very overt in the sense, especially with the African kids, because the African American youth very often want to separate themselves from them and say, you're, a lot of slurs. On the other end of things, a lot of the African kids are like, well, I'm not African American, and I have a much better ancestry than you. I have an intact family. There's a lot of observation on the part of the refugee and immigrant kids about what's going on in the people living in poverty in Springfield. So there's a lot of, it's constant otherness. I think, the Nepali kids, everyone thinks they're Latino. So it's an ongoing situation. And then when we come to first generation, we have an opening ritual, which is a welcome that is spoken in every language, and English is always last. So we've made sure that in terms of creating a space where, with some rebalancing, as we say, of the priorities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the things that has struck me in these conversations and in the festival is how a very simple medium or material can be used to make a very powerful artistic statement. When we talked with the Mexican artists, they work in paper because it's a common everyday material, and they hope that they can put it in the hands of as many people as possible to help them find their voice. Very powerful. On the same panel, we had an activist who helps migrants who have come over and are struggling to get across the desert. And the most basic help, which is to drop water for them and just help them survive. And I began thinking of her as an artist who works in water to a certain extent. And we heard from the Cubans today how they fashioned one 20-foot skein of blue fabric into the sort of backdrop of an entire show. And Kimmy, you work in sand, another very basic elemental medium, which is then used to create some very powerful and beautiful images. And could you tell me about that, both how you came to work in it and the power of the impermanence of it, I think, and how that's used in band. So talk a little bit about that.
I'm not inventing anything new. I did see there are some really amazing sand artists. If you ever look up Ukraine's Got Talent, there's this amazing video. I've seen other people do it. And a few years ago, I was commissioned by the Southern Foodways Alliance, which is an amazing organization, by the way, to do a piece celebrating barbecue pitmasters. And the motion of salting a pig, I thought, looked a lot like sand. And so we created a light box and a sand table, and I was doing that with a partner. But I found that I really liked the medium, and so I used it again in another piece, and then for this piece I thought it fit, just because the sand relates to memory and that you can't hold on to the pictures, and also because it relates to the landscape in Arizona, the desert. So it just seemed really fitting. I think I've done a few workshops with people where we've done sand drawing together, and it's a great medium. I think it encourages people to experiment because it's not permanent, and I think it's really forgiving in that way, and people are more apt to try things, and it's less about them creating pretty pictures and more about them being able to tell stories, you know? So yeah, I think it's a great medium to use.
Thank you. What do you hope, how do you hope to move audiences, or what kind of feedback do you hope to get from them, or what they might carry with them afterward?
It's been interesting doing the piece for different people. Some people relate more to the dementia aspect, and some people relate more to the Japanese American aspect of it. And I think having people be able to recognize something in the piece is important to me, and having them be able to relate emotionally to it, or just learn the history. That's also been an important thing. I think some people have come up and said, we just did the piece in Arkansas, and some people were saying that they never learned this in school. So it's been great to just be able to tell the story so that people know what happened.
Has there been a particularly moving, particular interaction that you could share, a story that maybe someone brought to you, or
It was great doing the show for my dad's colleagues. We did it up at Brandeis University. So there were people in the audience from the Japanese American Citizens League, these people that my dad had worked with in the past, and they were able to see it, and my dad's colleagues were able to see it. And there are some photos in the piece of those people, or their voices are actually in the piece. So it was nice to do it for people who had a relationship to my father, and so I think they had a unique experience with the piece.
And how did it make you feel, or how does it make you feel when you encounter people who had never heard of this chapter in history? And
I guess I'm just glad that I'm able to tell the story, but yeah, I wish it were a little bit more well known what happened. Yeah, so I guess a little bit surprised, and yeah.
Thank you. And Julie, talk about outcomes or movements that might come from the work that you do. What do you hope your groups accomplish, and both as groups and audiences? I think you're, in some ways, those are equal partners, but especially in what you do.
Well, the first generation vision or mission is really to hold the performing piece and the art creating piece as equal weight as the social justice piece. And for us, social justice is not just in the messages that the work contains or the themes that we're asking people to think about, but it's also in creating a space, a group in Springfield of peer mentors who are building their own capacity as leaders and mentors to other youth and also within their communities, and creating opportunities and access for them. So, and these work together, and then sometimes they work at odds with each other. So we're always doing leadership trainings. Our youth are learning how to facilitate circles. They're studying gender-based violence, and they are, taking workshops around many social justice issues and becoming, hoping to facilitate that and pass it on. So there's that piece, but at the same time, when we perform a high level of theater, as opposed to just having recitals, like school recitals, we get access to college campuses and theater festivals. And then our youth are on college campuses, and they start to feel like they belong there, and that's incredible. So like Sabrina Hamilton has, we're partners now with her, but she has invited us to be part of co-festivals. So they live on Amherst College campus when we do that for a week. Some of them never leave Springfield otherwise. Or some of them never leave since they got there, let's say. But we've also been invited to perform at another festival in Albuquerque, and we perform at Hampshire and UMass. So they get to know the local colleges. We just had a young woman who was born in the Bronx, sent to Guinea, West Africa to be raised by family, had an extremely traumatic life, came back to the States and lived in Springfield. She just got a full scholarship to Hampshire College. And she had already performed there, So it's just, she's there, she's in her second week of college. So this feels like social justice to me. It really does. Social justice isn't just issues and theoretical. It's on the ground change. So, and I know she's gonna change the world, so yeah, that's, but in terms of audiences and performances, the most powerful experience that we can have is that people see themselves in the stories and realize, people say, well, why don't you tell your story to me about your ancestry, your family experience? And I feel like I am telling my story. And that's what I want people to get, It's all our story. So if we can do that, that'll be good.
This is, I think, an earlier chapter for you, but could you tell us about your work in prisons, which I think in some ways was a seed of this? Yeah.
So that was like the unknown to me. It was like the trigger for this work. I don't have a formal theater background. I studied physical theater, and then I went to school for visual art. And when I was living in Connecticut, I was hired to teach a drawing and painting class in a prison, in a big prison. And the very day that I walked into that prison, I think a little switch was flipped in my mind, and I just saw concentration camp. Couldn't help it. And without knowing it, I had a full analysis of kind of what was going down with our prison industrial complex. This was in the early 90s. I just got it on a gut level, but then of course I had to educate myself as to what was really going on. So that drawing and painting class, which I was paid to do for about 20 weeks, ended up evolving into a theater project, which I worked on with a friend, Elsa Menendez. And we started this thing called Boom Theater, which went for about 4 years in Carl Robinson in Enfield, Connecticut. And so we kind of invented together a process to create. And a lot of the guys there were locked up for like 30 years sentences. So they were inventing with us. It was a real collaboration that went on for quite a few years. And then I continued to do that in the Hampshire jail. And we started, well, not with Elsa, but with another partner, started an outside company. So that work, I think, understanding the potential for creating community through artistic process, and also creating opportunity for stories to be told that weren't getting told in the mainstream media. That early work is what really informed me about that. And also understanding the connection, slowly but surely, of my own ancestry. I think now I'm almost in, like, I'm studying diaspora. I'm just, there's something so powerful for me meeting someone who's just arrived in the United States, and now it's on the news. Everybody's moving everywhere and not being allowed to get in and not being allowed to leave. But when First Generation started in 2008, I remember feeling so honored to witness a family's first 6 months or a year in this country, because I was getting fresh eyes on the United States and the way someone has to kind of deal with the systems here and navigate, and how they're perceived and seen, and how that shifts. And in First Generation, there's a lot of really interesting conversation about why the African American students or young people and the Latinos, they're not doing as well as the Nepali kids and the Sudanese kids, who have no doubt that they're going to be getting masters and PhDs, even though they came with nothing. So we have really interesting conversations about, you know, they're at a different, they're 3, you know, or 2 centuries or whatever it is into their diaspora, and didn't come. I mean, nobody really comes willingly. Nobody really wants to leave their homeland unless they have to. But when Africans came here as slaves, it was, you know, it was a much worse case scenario, and continued to be. So we really examine why it is that the Nepali families or the Sudanese families are all, the education is just like rolling forward. People own a car within a year. You know, they're all enrolled in community college or 4-year colleges, and it makes for really interesting conversations. Yeah.
Thanks. Kimmy, could you expand a little? We haven't explored the element of memory and dementia in your work, and just what, just how you're thinking about that, and its importance to the work.
So my dad's form of dementia is interesting in that it's not been so much that he's forgetting names and things, although that's part of it. It's been that he has a lot of delusions about things that are happening, and so this confusion about what's real and what's not real has been very interesting and frightening. But yeah, especially with the piece, it was really interesting. He kept thinking that there was a movie about him, or a radio program, or a TV program. They were all about him, and he didn't know why. But he would think, oh, it's happening next week, or it's, you know, it's on Broadway. He would think that I'd done a show and it had won a Tony or something, which was very flattering. But yeah, so it was, you know, thinking about him and his childhood. He would talk about how much he loved going to the movies and sort of escaping into the movies. And so this seemed in a way like his way of escaping what was going on. So yeah, the confusion aspect, I think, was interesting, in the way that the sand is able to transform from one image to another. I think kind of reflects that. So yeah, and also I guess this is sort of a tangent, but him escaping into the movies as a young kid. In the piece I show this Three Stooges clip, but thinking that there were these really racist things going on that he was probably seeing. He talks about how he would watch these westerns, like, you know, cowboys and Indians, and he was never really sure if he should be identifying as the cowboy or the Indian. You know, so yeah, all of those things are interesting.
Thank you. I think now might be a good time to open up to some questions, so I'd be happy to entertain some questions. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Julie, it was very interesting to hear about this engagement of these young people to come to their own sense of themselves and wholeness, their healing, their empowerment. But it's also about their families. So it'd be interesting to hear from you, how does this First Generation project also touch their families? Because it sounds like you get to know them as well. So how are they affected? And tell that part of the story.
Well, it's never enough. You know, like I have so many ideas of what I'd like to do. What we do is we have community and family events at least 4 or 5 times a year, where these are different from our performances, where we actually host, it's a big potluck, and we invite families to come, and maybe they have a story that they want to tell, or something that they want to, something that they want to share. And also we have other performers that come and first gen youth perform. So that's one way that people participate in the community. But they do get to know me because I often interview parents and grandparents as part of the artistic process. Or Wize's mom's voice is singing in one of our shows, and Ayana's grandmother is talking voiceover in one of our shows. So they know us as like a safe place where their kids can go, because we go away sometimes for 3 or 4 days or a week to Co, and it's the only time that these young people have been separated from their families. The first time is with us sometimes. So it's a huge trust thing that develops. I think they see us as a resource for their children. They recognize that we're going to help them get to college. They recognize that we can be an advocate for them legally or financially if they're having trouble with the food stamp thing or a court date. We're a resource in that sense. Medical, like doctor's appointments, navigating mass health and Medicare and Medicaid, and we're kind of one-stop shopping, or we can refer people. So they definitely see us as a resource, and it's a rare thing because a lot of offices close at 4 o'clock, or you have to spend 2 hours on hold. But with us, it's by cell phone, so they know, and so it's an extended family. What we would like to do more of is some support communities to establish their cultural traditions in Springfield. So for example, we've hosted some Burundi dancers to rehearse in our space. We collaborated for this is where I got all choked up, because our first generation started to support youth in their challenge of a first generation identity. The challenge is a lot of them end up in school and want to be American and throw it all out the window. And that really is a tremendous loss. We know what it means to suddenly be white and not have any culture, right? It's a loss. So first generation started to say, how can you be a young person, be your individual self, and honor your ancestry, your culture, your language? So when the Nepali community wanted to have a cultural festival, we helped them rent the space, rent the school auditorium, deal with printing flyers, stuff that they didn't know how to do yet. So that's a way, but I would want to do so much more of that. So those little things, there's one of the Ethiopian families, the woman wants to open a restaurant, so we made business cards together, and someone does hair braiding, we made hair braiding business cards. So it's kind of all over the place, a little bit here, a little bit there.
Yes, Michael.
Kimmy, the bend is brilliant. It's really wonderful. And I was interested in the combination of what seemed to be a really sort of rigorous process for you and a spontaneous process at the same time. And I wondered if you could say something about that.
Spontaneous. I never really thought of the piece as spontaneous. Well, I guess, yeah, because I'm drawing live.
In the sense that drawing is
Yeah.
always, there's always detours, and I mean, maybe there are, maybe that's what, maybe there aren't any.
Yeah. I mean, I've practiced those drawings over and over and over, so the marks that I'm making are pretty choreographed, but which I think is necessary, but it is always changing, as much as I do practice it, I'm not a machine, so it does change from performance to performance. And again, this isn't quite relating to your question, but I was really struck by this. I don't know if you listen to Radio Lab, this podcast, but they did a piece about memory, I guess a year and a half or 2 years ago, where they were talking about memory as actually being a creative process, which I thought was really interesting. And they were talking about how it's not like a filing cabinet where you're putting everything in and you're just retrieving it, but that they were talking about an experiment where they were actually able to disrupt memories in rat. It's a little complicated, but yeah, this idea of memory as actually being a creative process I thought was really interesting, and this idea that storytelling and me doing these drawings for you is a way of you guys having the story within you now, and so that's this creative thing. So yeah, kind of answering your question, but not really.
Yes.
Kimmy, I'm wondering if you can project yourself into the future and just imagine a time when you're done performing band, or that you're taking a pause, or what, and then thinking of the sand that's been holding your family's stories. What at that point do you do with the sand?
I'm not that precious with it, I mean, it's a material, and I think a lot of, and I struggle with this, the piece is partly about letting go and being able to let go of things and let go of the drawings. And so I think being able to let go of the sand is important. It is just sand that I bought at Home Depot, so it's, some people have asked me whether I'm going to make a videotape of the show, and I think actually, while there is a video just for archival purposes, I don't really want there to be a video of the piece that I share with people, because I think it's important that it's something that is live and that isn't contained somehow.
Yes, ma'am.
Kimmy, this question's for you. I assume part of your otherness quandary has to do with wanting people to understand something, either about you, your culture, your father, the internment camp. And you're obviously not first generation, as Julie's spoken about, but I just wonder along the way in your life with your family as one of the places where otherness and hanging on to whatever Japanese heritage you have, whether there's places within your family or educational or people you meet where you're able to explore this. How much do you hold on? Can you hold on to? Do you want to hold on to? Kind of goes all over the place, but you'll find a way.
Japanese culture has been really important to me in my life, even though I don't actually speak Japanese. That's been a big issue for me. But yeah, we used to go to Japan every other summer when I was growing up, all through elementary school and middle school. High school, I kind of rebelled and said I don't want to do this family trip anymore. But yeah, it's a huge part of nostalgia for me. So the second part of this trilogy is sort of about that. It's such a part of my childhood memories, but I don't belong there, and so that's been a difficult thing. Yeah, growing up, this isn't quite answering your question, but I grew up in the 80s, and that was when Japan was doing so well economically, and Japanese people were coming and buying so much real estate. And you'd watch movies from that time period, and they were really making fun of all of these like Japanese stereotypes, the Japanese tourist, right? Mm-hmm. And I think when I was growing up, I really wanted to distance myself from that, so like actually cameras and like taking pictures with cameras has always been this, has a lot of weight to it for me, which I think other people don't quite have. But so yeah, yeah, Japan's very, very much a part of my life, but at the same time, it's not exactly my home. Yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, I'm struck in both your work by that aspect in which something very specific, socially specific, like dementia or like isolation because of two languages not being able to share words, becomes metaphorical for culture as a whole, right? And that dementia is a concrete experience in your family, in your father, and yet within your piece, we all have the potential dementia of forgetting where we come from, forgetting our history, not as individuals, but as an entire culture, you know. And for you also, Julie, you know, you know, even if we have the same words, are we not speaking different languages? Right. And what is lost by that? And so my question is, how much in the way you actually create work recognizes the breadth of those metaphors? Or is that your work, or is that our work as the audience to see that?
Can you repeat the question? No.
Yeah, I find those larger issues really interesting. I want the piece to work on those much larger levels. I guess also in terms of dementia, and otherness, I think dementia is actually really interesting because it's taking someone that is really familiar and making them strange to you and making you strange to them, you know, and so in a way I think it's a great and terrible way for people to understand otherness, actually. But yeah, it's so I came up to Putney last summer, and when we met, you talked about Eric N. and his plays, and at that time I was starting to write this piece, Bend, and I was feeling a little stuck. It was feeling a little bit too much like I was just relating things that were happening, and I was so struck by the way his solography was able to talk about these very concrete historical things that had happened, these genocides, and yet he was able to use this really poetic language. And I thought, you know, that's what I needed. I needed to be able, I had sort of felt like, oh, I've got to tell it the way it happens, the way it was. But you know, actually, if you do open it up to this poetic language, you're opening up the experience to people in a very different way, and I think a way where some people can enter it, where they might not just, if you're just relating facts.
Do you have any thoughts?
I haven't so much thought about the dementia per se since I saw your show, your puppet show. But I think a lot about memory, and in the way that I like the blurb about Fon Allais, one of the things that I tried to capture was the idea that when you tell, we have experiences, and if we then tell the story or put them into words or into theater and imagery, that in a sense they become crystallized in a certain way. Whether the experience is good or bad, it takes on a life of its own. And these moments that are, and memory is that way too. Whether or not you put it into, you tell it as a story, I think we carry our memories with us, and they inform us in terms of who they are. They can be trauma memories and get in our way, or they can be sources of strength and fuel us and empower us. But there is, for me, it's really hard to grasp, but there's something very, you can change the way that that memory informs our life, because the actual experience is an interpretation in and of itself, right? It's so I think that in the work that that I might be creating, there's a reaching for touching upon all these things, but it's really, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think it's just as important for the person seeing them to make their own story about it or get what they get about it. Is that? Yeah. I don't know. That didn't really answer your question.
Yes, ma'am.
That radio lab piece, to me, involved taking out memories as if they were files, working with them, and then redepositing them, having been changed, by them. And the change is not only a change that happens to the memory, but it's also a change that happens within the person as the memory is changing, which I think is relating to what you're talking about. Right. And for me, the interest also on an individual level grows into the interest on a collective level when you are talking, for example, about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You, as a people, bring forth things that have been buried, hidden, covered with dust, and they come out in a way that transforms everyone who hears them, everyone who shares them, and that becomes a collective memory. And the telling of that collective memory by individuals who have participated in it can be a very healing and very magical thing. And it doesn't always work. Yeah. But I'm hearing connections between the two of you about that kind of process, which I think is a process that human beings uniquely share. I think elephants also do it. I have to say, for those of us who love elephants.
I was just talking about
that. But they live longer than anybody else. So, there's that too. Creatures that don't, fruit flies do not do it. That I know. Their lives are too short. But
we're supposed to be doing it.
Yeah, we're supposed to be. That's our job. Yeah. So in some ways, losing a memory may simply mean that you have come to terms with it and are able not so much to let it go, but to have worked it through so that it is like the sand. And then the sand is just waiting to hold another image. That's all it does.
But collectively, I just came back from Rwanda and I was learning about reconciliation, and it was so interesting being a Jewish person who doesn't walk around hearing about the Holocaust on a daily basis here in the U.S., but it's the lens through which I look at the world. So being there was really comfortable for me. I learned so much, and you couldn't have a single conversation with someone without the reconciliation and the genocide being part of it, and all their youth work, all their gender-based violence work, all their family work, all their community work is all inclusive, including peace work and reconciliation. And we have a lot to learn from what they're doing. And they're talking about memory a lot there. Yeah.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. And if I don't see one, yes, ma'am.
Yes, Julie, if you could share some more experiences of the people that actually have gone through your program and just how you've seen things change for them or for the people that have witnessed it.
I've been watching people grow up, for a few years. I guess a couple interactions that I can think of are, like in particular, this one piece that a young man wrote called Hunger, who was in Fonale, who never really had his father or his mother growing up. It was a very scary piece for him to share. It was a very raw cry. And he actually would numb out a lot of times when he was doing it. But afterwards, audience, some men would come up to him and say, thank you, because I've never talked about how much I wanted to be held by my father. I was never able to say that. So that was very powerful for him, because he suddenly knew that he was not alone. And it was also a great moment for the audience, to connect with it like that. Also, the stories that, well, in particular, Jamari, who, in Ripple Effect, this other piece that we did, he told the story of losing friends who became child soldiers. And the way that they were dehumanized by the army, that enticed them by offering them money, and then would give them guns, tell them to shoot someone who had a bag over their head, and then the bag would be removed, and the child who was 11, 12, or 13 would have shot their parents. And from that point on, the child has nothing to lose, and they become, that's how they train their child soldiers, or one of their ways. And Jamari told that story, and we had really interesting conversations in the group about what forms of dehumanization happen to young people in Springfield who are growing up there who join gangs, because we've had gang members in First Gen as well. And what are the moments in their lives where they felt they had nothing to lose? So these kinds of connections. Oh, we also had one crazy situation where there was one guy who came into the ensemble, and he had been incarcerated. He was young, he was like 17, and he had kind of one foot in each world. And he came up to Co with us, spent 4 days, and then he said he had to go back to Springfield. He couldn't stay. He went back to Springfield. When we all got back to Springfield, we got together, and it turned out that he had realized that he had robbed one of our members. And so there was this, talk about reconciliation. It was this moment where this guy said to this guy, I realized when you were talking about getting robbed, because Bush had been robbed, and it had been a very traumatic experience, and he was still recovering from it. He had been in a car accident and been robbed in 1 year. So he was talking about that. The other guy had realized it. So he came to him and he was like, I love you guys and I want to be with you, but I don't know if you can forgive me. I've never had to confront one of my victims. It was like, and we were all crying. So that's another example, I guess.
I want to thank Kimmy and Julie for your thoughts, and thank all of you for being so engaged and being here. Well, thank you.